Hey there! Today I'm going to share how I make these vibrant and glossy polymer clay charms. I'll be going through each step from start to finish, and you can find all the supplies linked in the description below or screenshot the list at the end of the video. Are you ready? Let's get charming! Start by wiping your glass or tile surface with isopropyl alcohol. Any percent above 70 works best. This helps prevent dust and debris from sticking to your clay. A glass or tile surface is recommended for best results, which I'll explain in more detail later in the video. After your surface is prepped, let's get the clay ready. I use the Sculpey Original polymer clay to make my charms. I like it because it's affordable and strong after baking and glazing. Knead the clay until it's soft and smooth. This is called conditioning. Conditioning your clay helps prevent your charms from cracking. You'll want to keep kneading the clay until it becomes soft enough to flatten out like I'm doing here without difficulty. Now it's ready to roll into a ball. Keep in mind that it may take longer to condition the clay in colder temperatures. Shape the ball into a rounded pillow shape. Now we're ready for the next step. To ensure that I roll out the clay at an even thickness, I stack 2 decks of about 13 cards together. The amount of cards you stack together will determine how thick your charms will be when you roll out the clay. Roll the pin over the clay while staying on top of the playing cards. You can see how the playing cards help the clay roll out evenly. Shift the cards around as you roll out the sheet of clay. Keep rolling and shifting the cards until the clay has a uniform thickness. If you see air bubbles, poke a hole in them with your nail or a toothpick. Removing the bubbles helps them not stay trapped in the clay when you ball up the excess clay after making the charms. And don't worry about any irregularities in the clay, we'll work around them. Gently roll the pin over the clay vertically to smooth the horizontal lines. Press gently so the clay doesn't get thinned out, since that would defeat the purpose of using the card stacks to create uniform thickness. To make the clay charms, I'll be using some cutters and stamps. I recommend using tiny metal cutters like these because they produce a clean cut and are easy to work with. But sometimes I'll use a plastic stamper like this one if it's a shape I like. Now we're ready to cut some charms. Position the cutter where the clay is smooth and flat, then gently press down and remove the cutter. This is where working on a glass or tile surface is important. A glass or tile surface helps the clay to gently grip to it. If you tried this on a wood or plastic surface, you'd run into the challenge of the clay getting stuck inside the cutter, because the clay would stick to the cutter instead of gently gripping to the working surface. The plastic stamper, I don't actually use it like a stamper. I find that pressing it down without pushing the button creates the cleanest possible cut. After you finish cutting all the charms you'd like, gently peel back the excess clay to reveal your charms. Next, we'll transfer our charms to the baking tray. I'm using the tray that came with my toaster oven, which I'll touch base on later in the tutorial. I recommend using a piece of cardstock as parchment paper to prevent the charms from sticking to the metal, and to prevent a plastic-looking film from forming if you bake directly on the metal. Next, you'll want to use a tissue blade to transfer the charms to the baking tray. You can see why they call it a tissue blade because it's very thin and very flexible. It's also very sharp, so be mindful of the sharp edge when using the blade. Here's what happens if you try to lift the charms without the blade. Because the charms lightly grip the glass surface, it becomes challenging to lift the charms without warping them. Keep the blade as flat as possible and use a quick and sharp motion. As you can see, the edges aren't perfectly smooth, which is okay because we'll end up sanding off any imperfections after baking. Using the tissue blade to lift the charms takes some getting used to, and practice makes perfect. Here you can see I didn't have the cleanest swipe with the tissue blade. It wasn't the worst, and I'll be able to sand the bottom to clean it up later. Here I'm just inspecting the bottoms of the charms I just lifted. Here's what it looks like if you accidentally slice through the charms. If this happens, no worries, just roll out the clay and try again. For me, it's a lot easier to use the tissue blade when there are less charms, and when they are more spread out. Now we're ready to bake our charms. When it comes to baking polymer clay, there are a few options. You can either bake your clay in a traditional kitchen oven or a designated toaster oven, which I recommend over a regular kitchen oven. The polymer clay I use is called Sculpey Original. It calls for 15 minutes of baking at 275 Fahrenheit for every quarter inch. My charms are 0.16 inches, so less than a quarter inch, or same as 0.25 inches. Even though it's a little less than a quarter inch, I'll still bake for 15 minutes. By the way, you could definitely use a regular ruler to measure. You'll want to use an oven thermometer to make sure that the temperature actually reaches 275 F. Because most ovens sometimes overheat before settling to the target temp, like here where I set it to 275, but it reached above 300, before backing down to 275 F. Next, use a protective cover made of tinfoil to prevent your charms from burning. The reason I recommend a designated clay oven is because if your clay does burn, which it shouldn't with a cover, it can release chemicals that I don't want in the same oven as I cook my food. When your charms are done baking, remove them and let them cool. You can see some bubbles formed during baking, and that's okay because we'll smooth them out during sanding. The charms are hot fresh out of the oven, so take care when handling them. Here are some small bubbles close up. Before we start sanding, I recommend prepping a hand towel and a spray bottle because they'll come in handy. And of course you'll need something to sand with. You can use sandpaper, but I personally love these sponges. I start with a 180 grit sponge first to remove larger bumps and bubbles. Then I use a 600 grit sponge to smooth everything out. Start by misting your sanding sponge. This will help keep the dust down when sanding. You don't want to get the sponge too wet because that'll dissolve the clay. Start by sanding your charms in gentle circular motions. Try not to sand one spot for too long so the charm doesn't lose its shape. Then sand the sides and edges. Here I'm spending a little extra time on the spot where the metal charm cutter left a mark. Then use the towel to clean up the charm to check on your progress. Now keep sanding until you removed all the bigger bumps and are satisfied. I'm making progress, but there are still some bumps to smooth out. Also, I recommend using gloves or single finger cots if you want to prevent accidentally giving yourself a bad manicure from rubbing your nail on the sanding sponge. Now back to sanding. It can take 1 to 2 minutes per charm. Now that the major bumps and bubbles have been smoothed out, I'm ready to repeat the process with the 600 grit sponge. Again, I don't want too much water on the sponge, just a little bit to keep it damp. Sanding on the second sponge is quicker than the first because all the big bumps and bubbles are smoothed out. The goal is to smooth any rough edges, and to smooth any scratches from the rougher grit sponge. When you're happy with the smoothness of your charm, remove any remaining dust and admire your work. Now repeat this process until all your charms are sanded. It's tempting to skip this step, but I promise it's worth it. Now we're ready to paint our charms. I'll be sharing 2 methods for painting your charms. The first method involves using traditional acrylic paints. This is how I first started making my charms. It's a good option because most crafters already have acrylic paint on hand, and it's great for blending and mixing colors easily. You'll need a variety of fine paint brushes since the charms are so tiny. I recommend using a small flat brush, a liner, and a spotter at a minimum. I'm going to fast forward through the painting process as I talk about some of the challenges with using paintbrushes to paint your charms. I find that it's a lot harder for me to keep a steady hand when using paintbrushes, especially for small details and line work. Also, using traditional acrylic paint can look more layered or textured when it dries, which I think adds to the handmade aspect of the charm. Here's a little spoiler alert. The second way to paint your charms is using acrylic markers, which definitely has pros, but it's not always as easy to blend colors, which is why I still love painting charms with paintbrushes. It took me a long time to find the best acrylic markers for painting charms. These fine tip Posca markers are my absolute favorite. There's also this set I found on Amazon that actually blends really well. Posca markers were originally used by surfers to decorate their surfboards, so they're highly pigmented and durable. These acrylic markers from Amazon are dual tipped, which makes them great for general painting and detail work. They're also nicely pigmented, which not all markers I tried are. I prefer to paint with these markers over paintbrushes most of the time. It's a lot easier to control ink flow from a marker versus a paintbrush. I can always paint much straighter and smoother lines with markers. It's so hard to paint such a smooth and straight line with a paintbrush. I usually accidentally press too hard and paint a thicker line with a paintbrush. I also like these markers because they're more convenient. I don't have to deal with cleaning paint trays or changing paint water. It's also easier to bring some markers on the go if I'm not painting at home. There are definitely pros and cons to both methods of painting, and it's up to you to decide which one you like best. Now I'm just adding some more details to the silly goose charm. And here is a side-by-side of the charms painted with markers versus paints. Let me know in the comments if you can tell the difference between the painting methods if I hadn't told you which is which. Next, I'll show you a neat trick for what to do if you make a mistake. Simply dampen your fine grit sponge and sand the mistake away. Wipe off the residue from sanding and you're good to go. This method works for both paintbrushes and markers alike. Here are all the charms I painted in this set. Can you tell the difference between the paints and markers? The best option for glossing your polymer clay charms is using UV resin. I'm using a simple at-home UV nail lamp. There are larger UV lamps that are great for larger projects, but it's not necessary if you already have an at-home UV nail lamp. It's just a nice upgrade if you get into making a lot of charms. Since I'm working on a glass table, I'm using a black mat to prevent UV rays from shining through. I also use a cloth over top when I turn the lamp on to keep the bright UV rays somewhat contained. I use these little charm trays I made to glaze my charms. I made these trays from air-dried clay. I haven't perfected them yet, so I'll show another way you can keep your charms stable while glossing without these trays. I recommend using high-quality, low-odor resin, and make sure your room is ventilated. I use this large silicone mold to pour my resin into when working with it. And lastly is a paintbrush to coat the charms with resin. I start by pouring some resin into my silicone mold. You'll want to avoid being in direct sunlight when glazing your charms because the sun's rays can cure the resin before you're ready. Now I'm using the paintbrush to start glazing my charm. Carefully paint the edges with a thin coat and avoid drips from running. Don't let the resin get in contact with any other surface than the charm because it will fuse the objects together like glue when cured under the lamp. You can use gloves or finger gauze for this step if you're just starting out and if you're worried about getting resin on your fingers. If you do get resin on your fingers, use nail polish grade acetone to remove and then wash with soapy water. After you coated the top edge, transfer under the lamp and cure for 30 seconds. After the charm cures, flip it to the other side. Then gloss the edge on the other side and cure. I like to work on glossing one or more charms while one is curing. After you glossed and cured the edges, gloss and cure the top and bottom faces of the charm. Carefully use a lighter to remove any bubbles. And cure for 30 seconds. Finally, gloss the top face of the charm. Here, I'm glossing the top of the other charm I was working on simultaneously as the silly goose charm. As an alternative to UV resin, you can use a polyurethane clear coat gloss. It simply air dries after painting and still provides a protective top coat. However, it is less durable and less glossy than UV resin. It's a good option for beginners. And here is the fully glazed Silly Goose charm. The UV resin glaze is strong, glossy, and water resistant. And here is the flower charm fully glazed. Now I'm just fast forwarding through glazing the rest of the charms in this set. But first I want to share an alternative setup to glazing charms with resin if you don't have these DIY air dry clay trays. You can simply use a small acrylic sheet and sticky tack. Roll the sticky tack out into thin tubes and arrange them to create bumper rails for your charms. You can now glaze the edge of the charms since the sticky tack rails provide a sturdy support for the charms. And now I'm finishing up glazing the rest of my charms. After I finished glazing all the sides and surfaces of the charms for 30 seconds, I put all the charms back under the UV lamp to give the top and bottom face another 30 seconds on each side to make sure it's fully cured. Now flip them over and cure the other side. All done! Now I'm just cleaning the mold that I poured my UV resin into. It's very easy to clean as the resin cures and peels off easily off the silicone. Clean the paintbrush you used for dipping into resin. Simply swirl it around in a cup with some nail grade acetone and follow up with some soapy water afterwards. Now that we've cleaned up and all the charms are glazed and cured, we can move on to the next step. To make the charms wearable, you'll need to add a screw eye pin. You'll need a tiny drill kit for this step. Here are the screw eye pins. Insert a drill bit into the drill that matches the width of your eye pins. Next, grab a cloth or towel to protect your charms during drilling. Wrap the charm with a cloth and position it vertically so you can drill a small hole right at the top of the charm. Then dust off the excess clay that was removed from drilling. This is what it should look like after drilling is complete. Now I'm just drilling the top holes in the rest of the charms. Finally, we'll secure the screw eye pin to the top of the charm using super glue. I like to add a little drop to a scrap piece of paper, and then grab a screw eye pin and dip it in the glue. You only need a tiny amount because it's super strong. Now insert and twist the eye pin into the pre-drilled hole. It will dry within a few minutes. Now repeat with the rest of the charms. And finally, you'll have a set of glossy polymer clay charms that are ready to be used in jewelry making or adding to keychains. All you'll need is some jump rings and some pliers to attach them, and you can create necklaces like this one I made here. The sky's the limit for what you can create with polymer clay. I hope you found this tutorial helpful and that you have so much fun making your own polymer clay charms. Stay tuned for more crafty videos. And make sure to check out the supply list at the end of the video, as well as the file in the description with clickable links to everything you'll need to make your own charms. If you love this video, I would really appreciate a like and subscribe so this video can reach all the crafty girlies out there. That's all I've got for now. See you next time!